Dear students, guests, colleagues, we are continuing our 3 in a row lectures, and now I will give the floor to our another honorary guest, that is Swiss ambassador in Russia, Eva Россье, who will make a short presentation on Russian and Swiss relations. The floor is yours.
Thank you. No, you should do that after, not before the speech. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for being so numerous. I almost feel like a rock star here. But I'm not going to sing, don't worry. I spent this day and yesterday at the Arctic Forum. And many people asked me, why does Switzerland want to be an observer at the Arctic Council? I think I've been asked this question 25 times. And as we have very good reason for being interested in the work of the Arctic Council, I think I will start with that. In 1912, six men and 25 dogs crossed Greenland. It was a trip of 650 kilometers. They made measurements of the thickness of the ice, of the snow, winds, and were the first to cross Greenland from west to east, at the most difficult and at the highest part. These guys came from Switzerland. And why did they came from Switzerland? Not because they were sailors. Actually, on the way to Greenland, they all got sick. Because we Swiss, we are not a country of sailors, as we have no access to the sea. But as soon as they were on ice and snow, they were home. If you look at the map, and I think you know that in Russia better than anyone, how much the geography has an impact on the people, on the way they live together, on societies, and on countries. In Switzerland, we have an Arctic environment. But it's not in the high latitudes, it's in the high altitudes. If you go high enough in Switzerland, above 3,500 meters, you see the same climatic situation that you have in the Arctic. We even have, as the only country in Western Europe, we have permafrost in Switzerland. About 3–4% of the territory is permafrost. We have glaciers. The highest concentration of glaciers in Western Europe is in Switzerland as well. It's shrinking, but it's shrinking everywhere, so we will still have the highest concentration of glaciers. And what's more, and I think that makes it different from other mountainous countries, in Switzerland, the mountains are in the middle of the country. You have Alps in France, in Spain, mountains in Spain, not Alps. You have them in Italy, but they are always the border. They are far away from the center. The mountains in Switzerland are just in the middle of the country. That is, we lived in these mountains all the time. The mountains is not a very far away place where nobody goes and nobody lives. We actually have been living in these mountains for centuries. And I think this connects us with Russia. Russian Arctic is not only ice, nature, polar bears, and plankton, and so on. It's as well people living there, here in Norilsk, in Murmansk, and so on. So this environment is as well an environment that is inhabited by people. And as that has been the case in Switzerland all the time. It's as well in our history and in our memories. When I was a child, the stories I was being told were very often stories of danger in the snow, in the mountains, and so on. There was the story of the little boy who goes to the school and comes back, the house is not there. The mountain has fallen on the house or on the village. Or the man who goes out to see the cows during the storm and never comes back. Or the house that is been found in the mountain with food on the table, with tea on the oven, and nobody is there, and nobody knows where the people are. So all these stories are stories that I heard as a little boy. Because again, the mountains in Switzerland, this environment we are talking about, is an environment in which we lived. It was not a border environment. As we have this environment, we notice one thing that you notice as well, is the impact of climatic change. And it's interesting to notice, as you know, the temperatures have risen faster in the Arctic than the world global average. In Switzerland, it's the same. The temperatures have risen faster in our Arctic environment, our vertical Arctic environment, than in the rest of the country. Actually, almost twice as fast. If I recall correctly, I think it's about twice as fast as the worldwide average or in the rest of the country. And we see the impact already now. Our glaciers are retreating faster than ever. Fast enough that I can notice it. If I go to a glacier after 5 or 6 years, I see the difference. The glacier is shrinking. And it's not only shrinking in length, much more important is it's shrinking in thickness. So the glaciers are getting thinner and shorter. And this we can see it. The third reason is that because we've been living in that environment, the economic development has always been extremely important for us. That is, the Alps, the mountains, is not only a place to protect. Yes, it has to be protected, but it has to give room for the activities of man. If you have a big country, if the population lives far away from the mountains, it's very easy. You can just say, we will make a protected zone and we will not do anything there, and the nature will be able to recover. In Switzerland, you cannot do that because people are living everywhere, almost everywhere, except at very, very high altitudes where nobody can live anyway, not even animals. So we have to find a way to protect this environment that is changing, but as well to make sure people can live there. They can work, they can travel, they can get internet, they can get electricity, clean water, roads, railroads, and so on. And in the history of my country, this infrastructure has been one of the cornerstones of the construction of the country. Actually, Switzerland of today was born in the 19th century when we built trains, tunnels, crossing the mountains, mostly north-south, because Switzerland sits just on the main north-south routes in Europe, the historical ones. And that's why there is Switzerland. These routes crossing the Alps, the shortest route crossing the Alps, between the two richest in those days part of Europe, which were northern Italy, and southwestern Germany, and the Netherlands, the Low Countries, this road was passing through Switzerland. So the people who were living there, who were extremely poor, they were sitting on strategic roads. And that was very good for them, very good for business, because if you had to cross, you had to pay. And as well, if you control the road, you can close the road. So you have a political impact on one side of the road and on the other side of the road. Why do I tell you that? Is that our approach of the Arctic problematic is an approach of protection of the environment. It is an approach of taking in account the climatic change, see if we can mitigate it, but above all, how do we react to it? Because we have to react to it in Switzerland too. Because in this environment I mentioned, we have thousands and thousands of people who live, like you have people living in Norilsk, in Murmansk, or in Arkhangelsk. And if you take the example of Norilsk, we know in Switzerland that their alternative is not either economic development or protection of the environment. You cannot say that. Because if you say it's one or the other, it means you have to close Norilsk. But thousands of people live in Norilsk and then produce added value. And many other people living and livelihoods depend on Norilsk. So you have to find a way, and that's what we are trying to do in Switzerland, to reconciliate those two parameters, the protection of the environment and the maintaining of a livelihood for the people who live there. So the first aspect, I would say, why we are interested in being an observer to the Arctic Council, and I think the most important for us is probably the scientific aspects. I don't know what you know about Switzerland, probably not much, which is fair enough. And you should, one thing perhaps keep in mind is that Switzerland has always been an extremely poor country. Now you think of Switzerland of money, banks, and so on. No. Until the 19th century, Switzerland was one of the poorest countries of Europe, poorer than Ukraine, poorer than Poland, because we had nothing, just those roads. 60% of the territory is mountains. You cannot grow anything or just enough to survive. So the only product of export we had were people. That's why the Swiss fought in all European wars until the 19th century. If you wanted to live, to have some money, somebody of the family was going to fight for the King of England, for the King of France, for a duke or a prince in Germany, or whatever. They even fought in Russia. You had, even when Napoleon came, you had Swiss in the Russian army and Swiss in the Napoleonic army. And many times the Swiss were on both sides in wars and were having to kill each other. So when your only richness is people, you quickly come to the conclusion that you have to invest in people. If you have no oil, not a good agriculture, you have to invest in people. And that's why when we made modern Switzerland in the 19th century, one of the two biggest priorities with infrastructure was education. And the educational system was one of the first federal competence. The two federal universities were made in the 19th century, and we pushed this educational aspect extremely high. That's why today our universities and polytechnical institutes have an excellent ranking in the world and conduct high quality research, are extremely internationally, have a broad and deep international network. I give you a few examples. We have in Switzerland an institute that is called the Swiss, it's a very funny name, but it's the Swiss Institute for Snow, Forest and Landscape. This institute has been working on snow because snow is an extremely interesting thing. Unlike rain, it stays. So you can analyze the quantity, the quality, where, when does it fall, how does it fall, when does it stop falling, when does it transform into rain. It works on natural hazards in mountains, avalanche, accidents are in this environment, accidents are frequent because it's an environment that's constantly moving. And work on the ecological system of high altitude, which are very similar to the ecological system in the Arctic, except the polar bears. We have a high altitude research station at more than 3,500 meters on the Jungfraujoch, between two of the biggest mountains of the Alps. We built a railway up there in the last century, and they are monitoring the living condition and the ecosystem in the area directly on the spot. We have constantly scientists working there, and it's a bit like working in the Arctic, except you can go by train and you don't go by sledge. We have as well the World Glacier Monitoring Service in Switzerland. When our neighbors make fun about Switzerland, they always say we are very slow. And it's probably because we are very slow that we were the first to notice that the glaciers, they move. Nobody sees it. But we were the first to see. When you watch a river, you see it flowing. When you are next to a glacier, you don't see it flowing, but it flows, it moves. So we've been studying the movement of the formation and the movement of glaciers for over 1 century. It's as well, Swiss scientists have developed the capacity of taking what we call a carrot. A carrot is a history book written in the ice. If you want to know what were the conditions a long time ago, you dig in a glacier deep enough and you take a portion of ice, a little bit like that. If you know how deep it was, you know from which period it dates, and by analyzing what's in it, you learn a lot of information about the climatic conditions in those periods. It's like when you cut a tree. When you cut a tree, you can as well see the life of the tree in the various circles in it. It's exactly the same with the ice, and that was an invention of the Swiss. And today, on a research station in Antarctica and in the Arctic, it's usually Swiss scientists that are conducting this research work on the quality and the nature of the ice. Finally, we just made last year a Swiss Polar Institute, because we have these many capacities at our universities dealing with Arctic and polar conditions. And this institute now will be actually the way to carry much bigger projects like the one we carried this year. It's actually just finished. It was 3 months of circumnavigation around the Antarctica on a Russian boat, the Academic Treshnikov, with scientists from 20 countries conducting hundreds of researches on the plankton, the quality of the water, the currents in the water, the winds, the snow, the ecological conditions on the various islands around Antarctica, and so on. We will need probably many years now to digest, evaluate, and bring to purpose all the scientific data that we've collected in the Antarctica. And I can tell you, we are now thinking of doing the same in the north, and it's going to be a big project as well. Finally, concrete, I noticed as well when I prepared this speech that the Geneva University has a project with NARFU in the floating university. We will be sending students this year in August or in July, I think, on the boat. We will as well do it later on in August 2017. That will be on a station on Samoylov Islands in the delta of the river Lena, as well under the direction of the University of Geneva. And finally, and this is something I did not know, the biggest collection of Inuit art is in Bern in Switzerland. Don't ask me why. It was a private collection. Probably it was a person that was extremely fascinated by Inuit art. And this collection is now circling around the various Arctic countries. It's until now, maybe somebody else will go further, but until now it's the biggest we have made. So that's why we came to this candidature for the Arctic Council. And actually, it was first a call by the scientists in Switzerland. I remember very well, 3 years ago, political Switzerland was not really interested at that time for Arctic matters and the Arctic Council. It was the scientists who came to us, to the foreign ministry, and told us, you have to move now, because we have so many things to do, we are doing so many things, we have to integrate in this network of the Arctic Council. And it's actually the scientists who launched the idea of this candidature that is now, of course, has the full support of the political Switzerland. But it was first a decision, a political decision, of course, but it was made by scientists and not by politicians at the beginning. The second reason is, of course, ecology. I told you we have to learn, and we are still learning, how to accommodate the livelihood of people living in a fragile environment and the protection of the said environment. There is another point in Switzerland that probably led to the development of this way of handling the economic development. It's that the country is small. When you have a small country, rather densely populated where people live, you have to take care of the environment. You don't have a huge river where you can put all the dust, the garbage, and throw it away. Because if I throw my garbage away in Switzerland, it will land in the garden of my neighbor. We don't have this reserve of environment where we could just dump the thing we don't want, pollutants or whatever, because we are living everywhere. And that's why what we call now clean tech, I don't know if you've heard about it, this new notion, to make technological development helping ecological development is extremely advanced in Switzerland. We have lots of companies working in the clean tech sector, and this approach, clean tech, ecology, economic development, is the second reason why for us to be an observer in the Arctic Council is of crucial importance. Geneva, you've heard about Geneva. Geneva is now not only the base for many UN institutions and international organizations, but as well the base for the Green Climate Fund. Geneva is becoming the capital of worldwide cooperation around not only climate, but ecology and environmental protection at large. For us as well, that would be a way to use the potential of Geneva, where everybody meets all the time, and to use this potential for the cooperation within the Arctic Council between the members, of which we will never be, but the members and the observers. Among them, we aspire to sit soon, hopefully this year. And finally, of course, I must be frank, it's as well extremely political. Because the Arctic Council 20 or 30 years ago, during the Cold War, was a place where very few people were working, but they were working together on rescue missions. They were mostly scientists or soldiers watching each other on both sides, from little Diomede to small Diomede in the strait. Now it's different because of the climatic change, but this I will not tell you. First, you know it, and I'm sure everybody before me has already said it, so you know that changes completely the thing. Singapore is interested by the Arctic Council. Not because Singapore has mountains. Singapore is a town and it's a port. But because Singapore sits on the biggest trade route, the Straits of Malacca, And the development of a new trade route by sea is, of course, crucially important for Singapore. Greece is interested to the Arctic Council. You don't have glaciers in Greece. Greece sits on the Mediterranean. But Greece has one of the biggest merchant fleet in the world. And if these routes become accessible, get accessible all year through, of course, that will deeply modify the trade routes, the exchange of goods, the speed of the goods, and the ports some ports will grow in importance, and some will probably lose. You, I think, in Arkhangelsk are among the winners. I mean, what you lost because of Peter the Great, you might win it again now, thanks to the climatic change. Finally, the criteria. You have criteria for a country to be accepted as an observer in the Arctic Council. The first criteria is to accept the objectives of the Council as it's stated in the Declaration of Ottawa of 1996. We're done. That's done. The second is that we acknowledge the sovereignty and the jurisdiction of the Arctic states, which is fairly normal because they are just living there, their people are living there, so they are the first directly concerned. So for us it's quite normal that the ones who are directly concerned decide, and that the others, like Switzerland, as observers can help along, contribute to the work or to the finding of solutions when there are disagreements. The framework should be international law. Switzerland has been pushing for international law since it exists. Not only because Geneva is in Switzerland, but mostly because the framework of international law gives the stability and the predictability to international relations that you could not find, that you could never reach without it. So, for instance, the UN Convention on the Law on the Seas has lots of elements that can guide the way how to deal with disagreement or with new questions that arise in the Arctic, questions that did not exist before because they were under the ice. But when the ice is going, then this question arises. Who can travel? Who has access to natural resources? Can you take fees from a boat that comes? Who can fish? Who can decide who's fishing? Who will set fish quotas? And so on. All these questions are new because before they were buried under the ice pack and nobody was asking himself or herself the question. And finally, and I hope I convinced you before, an observer country to the Arctic Council has to bring something. I think Switzerland, no, I don't think, I know. Switzerland and the people who've been working with us, they know it too. Switzerland can bring a lot. On the scientific aspect, as I said, on the technological, clean tech and ecological aspect, and as well on the political aspect. This is perhaps not extremely politically correct to say, but this chummy atmosphere of the Arctic Council of the past days, even in the Cold War, this atmosphere has gone. New tensions are perceptible between the various members of the Arctic Council, and I think Switzerland, through our history, particularly our recent history, we have a tradition of dealing with conflicts. We never cut bridges. We keep the contacts open. We talk to everybody. We have no list of people we don't want to talk. And this role of Switzerland has been already used by many countries, even by Russia and other countries, to facilitate the solution of conflicts when they arise between different parties. Not necessarily military conflicts, but can be political, conflict of political or of strategic nature at all. And for this as well, the presence among the observers of Switzerland in the Arctic Council is, in my eyes, an added value not only for my country, but for all the other members, were they observers or members as such of the Council itself. That was it. So, if you were the Arctic Council, and now you have to vote about Switzerland's status as an observer, would you vote yes or no? If you vote yes, could you please raise your hand? Yeah, how about 50%? Okay, I will try to do better next time. So, thank you very much. Above all, I'm here to answer your questions, if you have any.
Okay, so in the Arctic, there is a lot of natural resources, massive, but most of it belongs to Russia, to the States, to Norway. How can Switzerland make a benefit of this, directly or indirectly? That's all.
Yes, I mean, the natural resources, they never belong to nobody, except perhaps in fishing, and that's probably one of the reasons why we have so much overfishing. So it belongs to the country on which territory the resource is, but then you have to get it. It's not enough to have natural resources of your territory. You need the technology and the financial capacity to go and get it in order to sell it to the markets. Switzerland is, I would say, in three ways directly interested. First, the biggest place of trading in natural resources today is Switzerland. For oil, for commodities like wheat, gas a little bit less, because the market for gas is still a bilateral market where you have two countries making a contract. The spot market for gas exists, but it's still limited compared to oil. So the first reason for us why it's interesting is because it's very likely that that will be traded in Switzerland. I mean, all big Russian companies have a trading office in Switzerland, but not only Russians. From the whole world, they trade in Switzerland because Switzerland gives a framework of regulation that allows for these activities to be done probably in the best possible way. Second aspect is clean tech. As I mentioned before, the more difficult it is to get a natural resource, the biggest is the impact on the environment. Because you have to drill very deeply. You have to build huge infrastructure. You produce a lot of waste. So the second aspect is that we have many companies that are extremely developed, and they work actually in the whole world by now, in clean technology. So clean technology not only for extraction, but as well for extraction. But clean technology for extraction, for transport, for processing, and so on. And the third reason is actually probably what would be the reason for every other country. It's that to be able to follow from a position of an observer in the Arctic Council, the decisions that are being taken there is extremely important. You know the structure of the council. You have the members and you have the rest. When it matters, it's the members that decide, and they like it this way, even if they don't agree. Even when they have troubles among them, they don't want to get new members because that would make it too complicated. So the decisions that will be taken have an impact worldwide, and they are taken only by the members of the council. That's why it's for us important to be there as an observer. Take the new fishing zone in the Arctic. You know, the ice has been retreating, and you have a place now of free sea that is international sea, not the special economic zone of the adjacent country. So it's free, basically. And the question that's being asked is what should be done with this new sea, because before there was ice on it. And that is extremely important, because it's a place that is very valuable for the species that are reproducing, fishing, and eating there. And that's one as well for the reason, I would say that's the third aspect why it's important for Switzerland. Sorry, I was a bit long, huh? Sorry.
Good afternoon. Victor Thierry from Montreal, Canada. I got a question for you, Mr. Rossi. As you know, in the Arctic Forum, the main point was humans in the Arctic. So do you think that Switzerland has something to introduce for the northern communities to develop them? You mentioned clean tech. Do you think that might help northern communities to improve their life? Or do you think that Switzerland has something to just improve these communities?
No, I think more than ever, what you call northern communities, you could say that of Switzerland that we were historically an alpine communities. And if I look at the way my great-grandparents or further lived, that was closer to this way of living than to the people living in Paris, Berlin, or Rome. So there are two ways to look at it. You've got the way, I would say, alongside the line of the UN Declaration of Indigenous People, which is the preservation approach. That is, if these communities want, but I think they must want it, because you do not put people in zoos. If these communities want to keep the traditional livelihood, that should be protected and encouraged. And this is something Switzerland has always been pushing. I mean, just to give you one example, you know, the International Whaling Commission, Switzerland is a member, but we don't eat whales. But it's a Swiss who is now leading the working group that prepares the attribution of fishing quotas for whales for indigenous people. And I think it's not a coincidence that they went to get this Swiss guy. He's a guy who knows the mountains. He's a hunter, actually, so he knows what it means. And although Switzerland has no sea, it just happens to be a Swiss that has to do now that delicate work of attributing the fishing quotas for the northern communities. So that's for the first aspect, the aspect protection. But again, protection, as we're talking about human beings, not animals, protection is not something you can impose on somebody. If a community wants to stick to the traditional way of living, fine. But if a community wants infrastructure, hospitals, schools, jobs, this has to be respected too. You cannot tell this community, just keep on living as your ancestor lived. And that brings back to what I said before. We learned that this environment that is fragile, the Alps, has a value because people live there. So you have to make economic development and you have to protect the environment. That's for the other way, the way that is not the traditional protection of the livelihood. So I would say on both ways, yes, we have an experience that we have in our DNA, in our genes, in our history. You are all hungry? Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thanks for your patience. Bye-bye.